If you're our guest today, let me explain that you catch us right about now in the middle of a series that is comprised entirely of questions asked by our congregation. And then we're going to devote a Sunday to answering some of those questions that were submitted. And kudos to the brave person who asked me this question. Why is the American church shrinking? By church, we mean not just church attendance, of course. We also mean affiliation with Christianity. That American Christianity is shrinking, I think you know, but let me flesh that out for you just a little bit more. The last 10 years have seen more people under the age of 40 leave the church in America than at any other previous time in our history. By the year 2050, 40% of all churches in existence today will close. By 2050 or 2060, America is going to cease to be a majority Christian country. These are the facts as they lay, and those trends that I just cited actually seem to be insurmountable. The dominoes have started falling, and it will be very hard for us to avoid those outcomes. So this is a sprawling question about which many people write many books, or many people conduct many research projects, and there are a bunch of different ways to get at a decent answer to this question. One of which would be we could spend time talking about the reputational problem that the American church has in 2023. I mentioned this in a sermon a couple of months ago. When you ask adults below the age of 40 about Christianity and their impression of Christianity, the top 6 things they say are all negative. We have a reputational problem. If that interests you at all, I'll give you a link in tomorrow's email where you can explore that more. We could talk about our methodological issue. What do I mean by that? That adult life in modern America, 2023, really doesn't fit with how many of our churches are structured or designed. As the Dean of Students over at Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia says it, most of our churches are structured in a way to reach a world that no longer exists. So we could talk about what are the structural and methodological things that we need to do differently in order to better incorporate or enfold adults in America in the 21st century. If that interests you, again, there will be links in tomorrow's email. We could have a biblical conversation because there are several places in the New Testament where we are given specific warnings about how it is that churches lose their witness in the world. One of the most well-known are 2 chapters early on in the book of Revelation, written to 7 churches in what is now the modern country of Turkey. If you want to read those this week, you can do that again in the email tomorrow. But I want to come at this a different way, maybe in a way you've never considered before. And the reason I chose to come at it this way is because it's not just going to help us diagnose the problem, it is also going to help us have some hope. While it is true that churches in the West, by which I mean Europe and North America, so including America, are shrinking and shrinking fast, it is not true that Christianity is shrinking globally. In fact, Christianity in what we call the global South, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, is exploding. 100 years ago, 82% of the world's Christians lived in North America or Europe. Today, almost 70% live in the global South. The world is changing, and in fact, the face and makeup of Christianity is changing. The lingua franca of Christianity used to be English, not anymore. Now it's Spanish. There are more Christians in China today, a country openly hostile to Christianity, than there is in all of continental Europe. The Christian world is changing. The general secretary of my old denomination, the Dutch Reformed Church, the Reformed Church in America, has spent his retirement years learning from the church of the global South and then passing on to us in America what it is that he's gleaned. In his book, The Future of Faith, he makes this claim: what is going on right now globally in Christianity is no less seismic than the Protestant Reformation. This is how much the global South is becoming Christian. So what I'd like us to spend our time doing this morning is talking about what Christianity looks like in practice in the global South, and what lessons it is that we here in North America can glean from these places where Christianity is flourishing. And I'm going to do that through a series of quotes by those who study this as a profession or as a point of scholarly interest. First, this comes from America's leading religious news service by someone named Tom Lynn, written just a couple of years ago. Often Christians from the majority world, that would be us, he means the West, Europe and North America. Often Christians from the majority world, I reversed that. He means the global South. Often Christians from the majority world have both a deep sense of God's supernatural presence in the world and an active expectation that God not only can, but will intervene in response to our needs and petitions. There is an expectant, persistent posture of hope for God to break through, end quote. That same retired General Secretary, Wesley Granberg Michelson, that I mentioned, says that if you ask the typical American about their Christianity, they're going to tell you one of two things. They are going to tell you what they believe, or they are going to tell you what they do. So they're going to maybe tell you the doctrinal distinctives of their particular church or denomination over and against some others, perhaps. Or they're going to tell you all the ways that they are investing themselves to serve others. These are not necessarily bad things, but please note that that quote about churches in the global South is more than that. This is the language of encounter. It is the language of experience. It is the language of expectation. There are two fundamental theological truths that drive the explosion of the church in the global South. One is heard in the opening verse of the famous Psalm 8, which reads, "O Lord, my Lord, how majestic is your name all throughout the earth." People in the global South believe that there is not a separation between the material and the spiritual world, but they are in fact intermingled. That you cannot look anywhere in the world, from person to person, from tree to flower to ocean, and not see God everywhere. But moreover, as Zechariah chapter 7 verses 9 and 10 says, "Therefore the Lord of all the heavenly host says, render true justice, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another." It is not just that the world is full of God and His wonder. It is that the God of all things says to us, I am interested in you, I see you, and I will act on your behalf. I want you to be as interested in justice as I am. For churches in the global South, these two things are linked. The world is God's habitation, and you can experience Him everywhere. And the God you experience everywhere is for you. Especially those of you who are overlooked and undernoticed. The poor, the weak, the widow, and the orphan. Very famously, Jesus announces his ministry in the Gospel of Luke with a citation from the beginning of Isaiah 61, which reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to free those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." When we hear that in the West, we hear that from a position of privilege. So we say to ourselves, oh, this is what Jesus is going to do for me spiritually in my heart. And sure, that's true. Or we hear it and we think, this is what God is going to do eventually when the kingdom comes and heaven arrives. This is also true. The difference, however, is in the global South, they think this is what God will do for them right now. And it also sets for them their agenda as Christian people. God wants to do this for us. This is also then what we want to do for our countrymen and our neighbors. How do you hear the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 4? Like an American or like a Christian from the global South? About another quote. This is from someone from Fuller Seminary out in Pasadena. He writes, "In Western Christianity, the primary locus of religion is the individual. For most people outside of the West, community and relationships are pre-existent, involuntary, and constitutive." You can tell this guy's a professional academic. But those are good words. We're going to come back to those. This means actual relationships take precedent over all else. Let me give you a fascinating set of statistics. In America, last year, 65% of the population claimed to be Christian. And yet, in the same year, only somewhere between a quarter and a third of the population was regularly involved in a community of faith. Now, there are probably reasons for that, like church has run some of those people off. But do catch the irony. There are more people who claim to be Christian in America outside of the church or regular affiliation and engagement with one than there are who are actually engaged in it. American Christianity, whatever else it is a religion of outsiders who are flying solo, who think that doing a Google search on a favorite topic or a point of interest is enough to be formed and shaped in the faith. And our brothers and sisters in the global South would have no understanding of that. Because for them, in those 3 10-cent words in the quote, community and relationship is pre-existent, it's involuntary, it's constitutive. We as human beings were born hardwired to need the positive impact and influence of other people in our life. That's what it means by involuntary and pre-existent. Community and relationships are constitutive. You don't get to define yourself as a human being. Without the impact and influence of others, you will be definitionless. You can only understand yourself in community with other people. The single greatest shaping influence in your spiritual life is your involvement with other Christians in an authentic, real, vulnerable way. Our brothers and sisters in the global South understand this. There's a Christian psychologist from a generation ago by the name of M. Scott Peck. He wrote in his well-known book, The Road Less Traveled, quote, "We can never be completely whole in and of ourselves. There is a point beyond which our sense of self-identity and development not only becomes inaccurate and misdirected, but even proud and self-deluding. We are inevitably relational creatures who desperately need each other, not merely for sustenance, not merely for company, but for any meaning, joy, and real growth in our lives whatsoever. I heard a podcast this week in which an Anglican pastor said, maybe the next era of the American church will be defined by countercultural community. Not billions of dollars spent on advertising or books or multimedia projects, but just the countercultural commitment to live as if we belong to each other and we need each other and we are less than whole without each other. Third, this comes from the leading Baptist research house in America right now. This from a paper summarizing their learning from churches in the global South. In countries where Christians are not the majority, like many of the countries in the global South, the primary issues of the gospel are essential, but the secondary and tertiary issues of the faith are not. Christian workers learn to work together for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom beyond their personal preferences. In the West, because our country has been a majority Christian country, we have had the luxury for decades, if not centuries, of going it alone, of operating in isolation, in dividing over doctrinal minutia. Not anymore. What our brothers and sisters in the global South can teach us is that it is more important for us to partner together for kingdom ministry than it is for us to be divided. Do you know why South Korea is one of the most Christian countries in the world today? It's because in the early 20th century, when Japan annexed what was then Korea in 1910, and then exploited its people and its resources for 30 plus years, the small band of Protestant and Catholic Christians, both indigenous and European missionaries, said, we are not going to side with our Japanese overlords, no matter how much they persecute or inflict upon us hardship. We instead are going to care for the people. And for decades, they suffered trying to care for the people who were being hurt. And now today, some decades later, one of the most Christian countries in the world is South Korea. In South Central Africa, 60% of all healthcare and education in the country of Zambia is done by Christians, not the government. This only happens because the various Christian groups that call Zambia home are able to say, let's work together despite our differences for the good of our neighbors. Imagine how this might transform our practice and ministry as American Christians. Do you know that in the Western world this has already begun to happen? The largest Canadian denomination is called the United Church of Canada. It's when the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists all threw their hands up in the air and said, we can't do it anymore, we don't have enough people or enough money, and God forced their hand to unite together to do ministry. We are at that inflection point too. Why on earth do churches think that they have to do individual youth ministry, kids ministry, adult ministry, Bible study, on and on it goes? This is no longer that era, and thank God for it, because it reminds us what really matters and what really doesn't. Last, and maybe most challenging, from someone who researches the global church at Villanova University. Historically, Christians in Europe and North America have been misled by the privilege and comfort that comes with occupying a position of power. In the minority and under duress, Christians will find it easier to access the truth of the faith, namely a commitment to new life in a new world. Perhaps you've heard of or read some things on what's called Christian nationalism. Much of the fear and anxiety that fuels Christian nationalism is represented in the first sentence of that citation. That we have become, in the West, accustomed to the privilege and comfort that comes with power. And we are afraid of losing it. Our brothers in the global South, brothers and sisters in the global South would say you can thrive and flourish when you are in the minority. In fact, the generations of Christians that set the world on fire and changed it forever in the Roman Empire were a minority movement, often beset upon by the great empire itself. And yet in 300 years, they changed the known world. I like the second sentence, and I like exactly how they say it. That actually, as Christian people, it is when we're in the minority and under duress that we can find it easier to access the truth of our faith. See, it is only when you're in the minority and you're under duress that you can be truly countercultural. Because you get it. Not everyone's like you. Not everyone agrees with you. So what? Jesus points that way. That's where we go. When you are in the minority and you are under duress, you tend to notice other people that are in the minority and under duress. Churches become more focused on people at the margins because they feel like they are people at the margins. The reason that so often suburban churches look like the suburbs is that we have the privilege of looking like the suburbs. And in so doing, we miss that there are so many people, like the disabled and the poor, the very old, those whose background is not like ours, who sit at the margins waiting for us to notice and to care. Is it not true that really only when you're in the minority and under duress can you live the words of Jesus? In Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 31, not when you're in the majority and in power? Jesus says, "But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other one also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who asks of you, and if anyone takes away what is yours, do not ask for it back. Do unto others as you would have done to you," Jesus says. It is when you are in the minority and under duress that you begin to see how beautiful, how liberating, and how difficult those words are. This is what our brothers and sisters in the global South can teach us. I don't know what the future of Christianity looks like in America, but we would be wise to heed the wisdom of the places in the world where it is exploding. And it would look something like what you see up on the screen. Encounter and experience and expectation. Community and relationships, not merely solo spirituality. Partnership for the sake of God's kingdom and its work. Thriving and flourishing as a minority group. I want to end here with one more quote from one more piece on what we can learn from Christianity in the global South. This written by 3 pastors, published just a couple of months ago in Christianity Today. In fact, we believe that the Church of Africa, Latin America, and Asia could actually save the U.S. church if American Christians are willing to assume a posture of humility and learn from our brothers and sisters in the global South. The operative words in that quotation are in red and underlined. If and humility. And let me just go ahead and say on record, Americans aren't good at humility. Any country that insists on its own exceptionalism as much as we do cannot possibly be humble. And I'm afraid that American Christianity has taken the same bait. We have thought, because of our money and our privilege and our schools for centuries, that the center of the Christian universe was us. And if you have heard nothing else this morning, realize that it is not. If we as the American church are willing to be humble, you realize, of course, biblically, that only good things follow if you're willing to take the posture of humility. And typically, only bad things follow when you're proud. James chapter 4, verses 6 to 8 says that God opposes the proud, but gives favor to the humble. And in fact, that God will lift up the humble. Psalm chapter 25, verse 9, God guides the humble in what's right and teaches them his way. The prerequisite for all of that is humility. Are you and I at a place where we are willing to admit to one another that what we're doing and what we have done perhaps for decades doesn't work anymore? And that we need to take on the posture of the humble student and learn from those who seem to be blessed in how they are the church and what they do as the church. And it ain't us. At the very least, if you and I were humble in this moment in American Christianity, we would grieve the fact that Christianity is something from which people want to disassociate. And that Christ, because of us, no longer seems compelling. At the very least, you and I in humility would say to one another that there are probably things that worked for us in the past that we need to leave aside as we move into our future. And maybe, just maybe, if you and I take on the posture of humility, our church and the American church will have a future. Would you pray with me? Lord God, we thank you for the example of our brothers and sisters across the world. They inspire us. They inform us. They can make us better. Lord, forgive us for thinking that all the answers must come from us because we are, whatever else, Americans. But instead, perhaps, the answers and wisdom we need lie outside of us. So help us take on the posture of humility, willing to learn, willing to try, willing to be challenged, and willing to be changed. And in our humility, may we find your favor, your direction, and your way. This we ask together for the sake of your kingdom in America. Amen.